Hello, and welcome to our weekly environmental news roundup. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media project at the Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalism. SEJ produces a daily email roundup of environmental news. It's free to subscribe. Look for it at sej.org. Each week on this program, we talk about what's been happening in environmental media. That's followed by a deeper dive on one or two issues. Today, I'm joined by Nasheen Hook, who's a freelance and energy and environment reporter based in Texas. Hopefully, we'll be joined a little later with David Hill, who's a fellow and adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. We'll be talking with both of them in a minute, but first, a quick roundup of environmental news from the week. And David just joined us, so let me drop him in and let me get a screen share going so we can show you some of the things we're going to be talking about here. So, David, we're just about to do our roundup of the stories today. So let's start with that. Of course, the big news story today, and something we'll talk a bit more about in a few minutes, is the on again, off again, on again bromance the Democrats have had with Joe Manchin of West Virginia. The senator has, on his own, scuttled President Biden's signature Build Back Better initiative over the past year and ended hopes of a major legislative victory that begins to finally address climate change with some amount of vigor. That is, until now. So Manchin and Chuck Schumer announced this week a new deal that's much less than Biden wanted, but more than Democrats have been hoping for lately. And now just one question remains, actually two, but what will Kirsten Sinema do to the measure, which is now being called the Inflation Reduction Act? This Washington Post story you see on the screen filled 30 paragraphs, but never once mentioned the Arizona senator, who will also have a major say in whether the package becomes law or not. Oh, and the second question, is there a poison pill in this legislation? We'll talk a bit more about all this in a few minutes. Next up this week, this story on a study of methane emissions by gas operations across the country. These emissions are not illegal or even regulated. I mentioned this story because SEJ is having a webinar on this topic coming up in about a month. Be sure to look for announcements on this important webinar soon. Extreme heat, excuse me, and heat deaths continue across the country. This is almost not news at this point because it's been talked about so much. But one aspect of this I haven't seen covered is the long-term effect of COVID on heat deaths. So I've argued since the beginning of COVID that the media messaging surrounding it was wrong. COVID required physical distancing, but we talked about social distancing, and what this did is create a lot of isolation. Research has shown that in major heat events, elderly with social connections live, while those without them more often die. In other words, elderly, especially those with mobility issues who do not have friends, neighbors, or loved ones to check in on them, die at higher numbers. And COVID, I believe, has created a problem with this. Many elderly lost their social connections while isolating. So deaths in that group may be going up. I'd love to see some of you doing stories on that. I think it's pretty important. And a quick note on this. My partner, it looks like that, there we go. My partner in crime here, Andy Revkin, has done a number of webinars looking at extreme heat, and they're worth checking out. Now, Inside Climate News has a great story this week about a surprising spin-off effect of wildfires. As we all know, wildfires are becoming more severe and their local effects can be horrific, but aerosol particles from the fires can mix with clouds in the Arctic, brightening clouds and reflecting more sunlight away, which slows the melting of sea ice. There's also an interesting discussion in this article about feedback loops and negative loops, so the story is well worth reading. Not mentioned here is whether soot makes its way to the ice. The darker soot could also increase melting. The world, as we know, is a complex place. There's a quick note on mapping for environmental stories. People learn. They take in information in different ways. Some take it in by reading. For others, visual aids help more. So graphics like those in this NPR story are really useful for helping some people visualize what can be otherwise very complex stories. Two more quick stories on environmental justice this time. First, a gentrification story disguised in a sense as a justice story, which actually it's both. On the surface, it sounds great. Workers are removing lead from yards in a historically black neighborhood in Atlanta, but the worry now is that as the neighborhood becomes cleaner, will rich folks begin moving in and forcing those out who have lived there for generations? And in this story from the Center for Public Integrity, more concern for toxics in the soil. It opens with a scene from an urban neighborhood in Houston. That's where Nushin is, where decades of pollution has made the community's soil full of toxics. Now, as flooding increases in some areas, the concern is that flooding will release those toxics back into the community. It's an important story and one that can easily be adapted to where you live. Where are the legacy industrial sites and the ones they call relics, those that are hidden away from government scrutiny? If you find those, you're going to have a lot of great stories that you can help inform your community about. And finally, let's end on a bit of a happy note. A new tiger assessment by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, says scientists have become better at counting tiger populations, and the result is a 40% increase in population numbers. They remain endangered, but this, of course, is really good news. That's it for our roundup. Now I'm happy to introduce our guests. Nasheen Hook is a Houston-based freelance reporter focusing on energy and the environment. She's written for news outlets such as Fortune, Bloomberg, and National Catholic Reporter. Prior to freelancing, Nushin worked as the Houston correspondent for Bloomberg Industry Group as a power markets reporter. And David Hill is a fellow and adjunct senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. He's a member of the board of directors of the New York Independent System Operator and also has his own law practice and energy consulting firm in Princeton. From 2012 to 2018, Mr. Hill served as Executive Vice President and General Counsel of NRG Energy, and from 2005 to 2009, he served as General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Energy. And for 3 years before that was DOE's Deputy General Counsel for Energy Policy. So a great background for some of the things we're going to talk about here. So we have two major topics ahead of us. First, the big news. Joe Manchin seems to have rejoined the Democrat Party. He and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced an agreement on the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the slimmed down version of Build Back Better. This bill contains a lot of money for the environment, but it's a lot of work to wade through hundreds of pages of legislation to parse out what's included. Fortunately for us, David has done that work. He spent probably countless hours and a sleepless night last night to go through all the bill. David, could you give us the top line on what this bill would mean for the environment if it does make it into law as early as they're saying next week?
Yeah, it's a really important development, I think. And as you were saying, Dale, I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages long. I think for anybody that actually goes and looks at the bill, it's sort of impenetrable if you just look at the bill text, because so much of it is amending the Internal Revenue Code. It's making various changes to existing law, and so if you're just looking at the provisions of the bill, it can be just like any piece of legislation. It can be hard to understand just looking at it. I do think it makes, in terms of the, it extends a number of tax credits for the construction of and for the development of renewables and various energy facilities. It actually is. And I think some folks have actually been out there saying that it really is a major, or assuming it's enacted into law, major step forward in terms of ensuring that the United States continues to move forward with zero carbon, low carbon energy technologies and moving towards some of the previously established emissions reduction goals. So And then of course, the bill has a lot of things that don't concern energy at all, having to do with negotiation of drug prices for pharmaceuticals and things like that. So there's all sorts of just like with lots of major pieces of legislation, in order to get it passed, there have to be lots of cats and dogs put in there. So this is this is another example of that.
Well, it's also it's the idea of the catch-all. It's the one shot they've got at reconciliation to get it passed with 50 votes instead of 60. So they want to put these other items in there, right?
Well, and Dale, on that point, I do think lots of folks they talk about legislation. Why can't Congress do more? Why can't members of Congress pass this or that? Well, most people, they're frustrated with Congress because they have a particular thing that they would like to see Congress act on. The thing is about it, the pieces of legislation, in order to get passed, they have to have something that different members with a lot of different interests and come from different parts of the country have to find a reason to vote for it. There's always a reason to say no. What is the reason that at least 50% plus one can say yes? And so that's obviously, as we all know from experience and just watching things happen, is always tricky. And so this bill is just a good example of why there are lots of things that get thrown in there in order to make sure that it does get to 50% plus one.
So overall positive, do you feel positive about it? Do you feel it's a good thing or not?
Yes, I think I think it's a very positive development, and particularly for purposes of would I personally have a mix it up in a different way? Well, sure, and just like everybody else would. But I think that in terms of it being a really positive development for moving forward with effective decarbonization in the country and in a way that makes sense, I think it's an important step forward.
Now, what about, well, Nushin, let me bring you in real quick to see if you have any thoughts on this. I know this is not necessarily in your wheelhouse, but you've looked at it. Do you have any thoughts on what you've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, spoken to anyone, sources specifically about this bill yet, but, leading up to it, I know a lot of people who talked to developer earlier in the year who do this, and they were looking at this bill. And if you look, one person I spoke to, at the beginning of the year when they were looking at the Build Back Better at that time, and possibly what would be in it, pointed to the 2009 stimulus bill and how, up until that point, renewables were, which was majority wind at that time, it was an unsure market, and that bill had grants, and, people in the industry really felt that that bill, really pushed, changed the market for renewable projects, specifically wind. And that something like this, again, because it's not just 2-3 year tax credit, but a decade, could really change renewables again. And now where there's a greater diversification, right? Not just wind, but solar, maybe hydrogen or battery storage, all of that. So.
And we'll talk about that with our next topic. But this is it's a robust industry now, right? It's not this isn't a long shot sort of thing. David, I'm sorry.
No.
I will say,
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, Nasheen. I was going to offer one other comment about just another aspect of it. Sorry to interrupt there.
Oh, no, I was just saying that, some of the people in tech in Houston specifically that I've talked to, attorneys that do project finance, a lot of them, very heavy fossil fuels industry over the last few years, their percentage of work they've done with renewables have increased in, almost half, over half. And big companies, right? So not just small renewable projects, but you see the majors also getting involved, buying companies. And so, yeah, so it's changed.
We haven't heard that talked about a lot, but that's saved ERCO in Texas this summer, hasn't it? The fact that they have so much solar and wind in the system now.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the heat that's going on and the heat wave and the demand for air conditioning, and the peak load for solar, of course, is midday, and that's when the demand for air conditioning is high. And so that's what's kept the grid from shutting down as it did, last winter.
Yeah, I mean, for different reasons, but yes.
And David, you wanted to add onto that?
Yeah, Dale, I was going to say just two things about it. One thing, one of my just a lot of what's in this bill in terms of energy, and particularly renewable or lower carbon energy, are tax credits. It is interesting how tax credits. I mean, there are other things that, of course, Congress could do that would actually be helpful, and yet they often go back to the same old tax credits. And I think that and I believe that the bill, there are things in terms of transmission that would have been useful in terms of some transmission tax credits if they're going down the tax credit route that did not make it into the final bill, and that could have been really useful. my personal opinion is that when it comes to tax credits, a lot of the companies that could potentially make use of tax credits, you think about a tax credit. Well, it's a credit against tax, and tax you owe. Well, a bunch of the companies that may have occasion to use these, they don't have a tax liability. And there are various reasons for that. But as a result, they have to engage in these transactions in order to monetize a tax credit. They're called tax equity transactions, which involve a bunch of kabuki with lawyers and consultants and all this sort of stuff. And so there's a whole process, as well as if you're an entity that's tax exempt and you want to take advantage of it. Well, you might not owe tax, and so therefore, how are you going to take advantage of it? And so it's something where, personally, I think that there's refundable tax credits, or they're called refundable tax credits, and Congress has actually done this before at various times, could actually be useful because it has the potential to really cut down on a lot of transaction costs in ways. I mean, that's just my personal opinion if they're going to go this route, but Congress, has decided not to do that here.
How does a refundable tax credit work?
Refundable tax credit really winds up being a cash grant from the U.S. Treasury. Congress did this. They've done it various times, but they did it back in the Recovery Act after the financial crisis back in 08, 09. And that's how they actually how they dealt with a lot of renewables at that time. There were issues with that program, just like there are with every program, but it actually allows something where you don't wind up going through the whole tax equity mechanism.
So the other sticky wicket or potentially sticky wicket is that release from Center for Biological Diversity, I think it was, saying that claiming there's a poison pill deep in the hundreds of pages of this legislation that I don't know if you saw that. I sent that to you, David, but it was saying that there is some issues with drilling, that there is a demand in the document that I think it's 2 million acres of oil leases be released every year for 10 years before solar and wind can benefit from this, which many environmentalists, if they see this, might consider that to be a poison pill to keep the bill from actually going through. Did you see that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I didn't see it, Dale, but I did read somewhere and I can't remember now whether I saw it in the bill text itself or whether it was in a press clip somewhere that I saw that there were some drilling provisions in there, or expanding drilling areas, or requiring the leasing of additional lands for drilling. I can't remember exactly what it was. Well, I mean, I guess the answer to that is just as I was saying earlier, in order to get a major piece of legislation passed, you often have to cobble together a bunch of things in order to collect votes, and I guess folks will decide whether or not, on balance, it's something they can vote for or not. But I think I have no doubt that if there are drilling provisions in there, there are some people who would oppose them. But I suppose for others, that is the reason they would actually vote for the bill. And so that's what just like any major piece of legislation, what it comes down to.
You don't want to know how the sausage is made.
Well, it's one of these things where if you look at major pieces of legislation, if you look at the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, I can tell you, I mean, the Clean Air Act, I mean, the CERCLA, I mean, all sorts of pieces of major legislation. They have things in there that a major piece of legislation that Congress passes, or a major appropriations bill, or these omnibus appropriations bills that will sometimes be passed, hundreds and hundreds of pages long, maybe thousands of pages long, and they have to be put together. Passing legislation is tough work, and involves cobbling together things and requiring sometimes compromises from folks that they don't want to. But it's a big country. It's a lot of diverse interests. It takes a lot of work to collect 50% plus one support for any bill.
Well, but the argument from environmentalists in something like this is simply that if you continue to support a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, you lock into place. I mean, you don't put that kind of money in place and then get rid of it in 5 years. It's a huge cost to build it and to operate it, and it needs to run for 20 or 30 years to be profitable in many instances. So uh, a simpler way of looking at it is we keep building houses, housing stock is going up. And if you build those with natural gas in them, then you're building in a 20 or 30-year pipeline need to supply those. So you're boosting the need for fossil fuels for a longer period of time. And that would be the argument against these leases and these other provisions that may be in this bill.
Yeah, and it certainly is that is an argument out there that and you hear it asserted a lot of the time in connection with I hear it most in connection with new natural gas infrastructure when it comes to new natural gas fired power plants or things like that. But you can hear it in terms of new infrastructure for refineries, for drilling, for anything.
Pipelines, yeah.
You're right, for pipelines. It really is something though where I think it presents a real challenge because we have for example right now out there you look at what the prices of gasoline are and or diesel, even worse in some ways, diesel fuel. And there are arguments that, well, look at this refinery capacity that's been shut down. Well, I mean and I'm sure the refiners are hearing why don't you run your refineries, and why did you retire those refineries, and you need to invest money in those refineries. Well, the refiners are trying to figure out, well, what's my amortization period on that. It's kind of for some of them, and I don't have anything to do with any of them. But I'm sure they hear, on the one hand, keep your refinery open, and on the other hand, we're working very hard to shut you down. I don't know. I mean, so if you're trying to allocate at-risk capital in that in that situation, what is it you're going to do?
Well, we want it open just until it's time to shut it down. So plan on that.
The thing about it is, if you're going to have it open for 5 years, if you're investing $1 billion and it's open for 5 years, or you're investing $1 billion and it's open for 20 years, the cost to run it each year is a whole lot different in those two things.
Right, and on the screen now is a promotion for my partner here at Columbia, Andy Revkin, writes a weekly column for Bulletin.com, which is Facebook's version of Substack, and he'll be talking about whether this is a poison pill or, as you say, a compromise needed to move this legislation forward. So be sure and look for that coming up in the next day or so. So let's move on to our second topic, and the main one that we started out with this week, and that's MISO, which is the electric, or MISO, I guess is the electric grid operator for the Midwest. They announced this week that they've approved 18 new high voltage transmission lines, and primarily to be used for renewable energy. And it's important because large-scale renewable operations are generally located in remote locations like Western Texas without access to these lines typically. And one of the things, and Nushin, you could talk about this, one of the things that Texas did was quickly get these lines in place so they could take advantage of that land out there. So building new lines makes renewable energy more doable. Nushin, that's an accurate statement, right? So we need these lines in order to get this energy into the grid, right?
Yeah, I mean, what Texas did with the CREZ lines, I mean, that brought all that wind. I mean, it changed the market, so to speak. They were, I think, a few years ago, wind was setting prices. You had negative prices in some parts of Texas, and kind of sort of the reason behind why even during the Trump administration and pro-coal, sort of promoting that, you had coal plants in Texas like shutting down, right? Some of the larger old coal plants. And so transmission is definitely a big part of that. The difference in Texas is you have Texas, one state. And so with this plan from MISO, I mean, it'll have to go to state regulators. And so I think I read about 9 state PUCs, and that could take months, because at the end of it, who's going to pay for it, right? And my understanding is, I mean, it will be just like other plans where, you know, it will be customers. And so, as you mentioned, Dale, you know, rural areas, right? So, you know, taking wind to sort of urban centers where, you know, you have that congestion. And so, you know, who's going to be paying the brunt? And so that's going to be a question that, you know, the need is there, but that is going to be an obstacle.
Well, there's several different elements I wanted to get at this, and a little bit of background, if we could. David, the grid, to put it politely, is not a new system. So where does it stand in its ability to take on renewables that are variable loads? They're not, you know, a main load like a coal plant would be. Is the grid able to handle more of this kind of energy?
Well, I think that the different parts of the grid have been around for a long time, have been around for a number of decades. I will say that, and as you mentioned earlier, Dale, I mean, I'm on the board of the New York Independent System Operator. I've worked around in the industry for a long time. The industry has the facilities in different places are old. I mean, they're newer in some places. But the grid has whether it's the individual transmission operators themselves, or the independent system operators, or the regional transmission organizations, had very, very sophisticated operators and systems to run the system. It's I think the public should. I mean, it is an incredibly complex system, but the people who run it are very smart, honestly, and very, very good, at optimizing that system. I think your question, Dale, as to is the system really capable of going where we kind of want to go with it? If we're talking about a decarbonizing system, and one where we would have more solar, more wind, maybe more batteries, where a lot of the fossil fuel generation already has retired in a number of places. Some of the nuclear is retired, and there used to be a lot more nuclear in different parts of the country than there is now. Although some of the facilities are still, you know, at this point, several decades old and still have decades to go. But I think that you do look at some of the situations where, and as Nushin was saying, Texas, and within the ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is a perfect example of it. Texas went forward and developed she referred to the CREZ lines, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone lines. Those lines really were, Texas was very forward thinking, I think, in building those lines, which then enabled the renewables to be built at the other end of those lines. It wasn't as if everybody was going to go build a bunch of wind out in the panhandle of Texas and just hope that some transmission ended up getting developed someday to deliver that power. That's not the way it works. And so Texas really took some very aggressive steps forward. I don't know what, Nushin, I mean, almost 20 years ago, probably now, 15, 20 years ago now, maybe even longer ago than that. But in other areas, and you look at the upper Midwest as a great example of it, where there's a lot there, and that's not the only example, but there are other areas where there are great wind resources, but how is it going to get to load centers? I think the new MISO announcement, and I haven't had any personal involvement with it. I mean, all I really know about it is from what's been publicly announced. Those projects are they're both they're really reliability focused. They'll enable new resources to be put on the system, but they address some particular reliability concerns out there right now. And also, at least according to the MISO analysis, have a huge favorable cost benefit assessment as well, in terms of the benefits far exceeding the costs of those lines. So that's always a tricky thing to calculate, obviously, when you're talking about spending $10 billion or whatever the number is here. But so that they're really kind of a variety of different purposes for building that new transmission that MISO looks like is moving forward with.
Can you expand just briefly on the reliability focus? So is this less about renewables and more about keeping the system robust, or
Well, again,
both?
in looking at what MISO has released, they really made a strong reliability case for the need for these lines to address some particular loading issues, some particular congestion issues on their system, and so just in terms of looking at the way that they've racked up the costs and benefits of the lines, a big chunk of their benefits are actually, I believe, and this is all publicly available information, it looks like, is assigned to reliability benefits.
Okay. Okay. So, Nushin, if these do indeed, well, let's talk about the simplest question. It seems like, well, okay, we're going to put some lines now, but it doesn't happen that way, right? This is a long and torturous process to get lines sited, land leases signed, and things actually built. Can you describe what that process is like and what the bottlenecks are there?
Yeah. I mean, again, my knowledge of this plan is like David, just, what's been publicly
Right.
reported.
But in general, when citing lines, this
Yes.
is a
Well,
pretty
I think,
well-known process.
right. Yeah. And I think in this particular case, I think most of these lines are going to be along like current, like, power line easements. So in this case, it seems like, you don't have to worry about, acquiring land, that these are going to be along existing lines. So that is one, if that's true, that's one hurdle they won't have. But of course, like MISO is a nonprofit grid operator. It's made up of, various stakeholders, including utilities and stuff. So, so you still, you do have all these separate like state entities as well, right? So you have the PUCs that are involved in, the rate structure, and then, you also have federal regulators as well. So, you have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And so as well, when you're, citing these. So, and there's, environmental studies that have to be done. So there's a whole, there's a whole kind of, process. And so it can take years. Yeah. And each step of it, and each of the different studies that need to be done, and approvals from various agencies. So, and I think also I read, and again, this is just what I read publicly, that these lines in MISO are, I think they're central in the north central part of the region, and that there might be other packages, coming out that might be like, this might be the first of 4. So, and I don't know if that, I'm guessing other parts of the MISO footprint. So, but yeah, it'll take a while. There's a lot of stakeholders involved.
And let me remind any journalists who are watching that we'll be in about 10 minutes, we'll be talking about what some of the entry points there are for journalists, how local journalists can look at these stories in their communities and find ways to start reporting on it. But David, why don't you talk about what's likely the most recent sighting difficulty in your region, which is the line coming down from Hydro Canada or Hydro Quebec.
Yeah, and as you were just mentioning a minute ago, Dale, and as Nushin was talking about, my understanding is, just going back to the MISO announcement, is that, and perhaps even part of the reason that they put them in this particular tranche, and that they've kind of gone about it the way they have with this first set of transmission projects that are addressed here, is because they do, according to the announcement, they're within an existing right of way, and and so it would presumably expedite their ability to get the lines built. Linear infrastructure, developing linear infrastructure, where you've got, if you're talking about transmission lines, highways, natural gas pipelines, things like that, are are of course incredibly difficult, because if you've got that 100-mile or that 1,000-mile long, well, maybe not 1,000, 300-mile long line, and your 295 miles are okay, but 5 miles in the middle of it are not okay. Well, then the other 295 are, what are you going to do about that? Are you going to go around it? I mean, so you've got to get it all put together. I think and when it comes to one of the things about siting of power transmission lines, so the federal government under the Natural Gas Act, if we're talking about gas, the Natural Gas Act, the reason why there can be interstate natural gas pipelines the way they are is because in the Natural Gas Act, which was enacted, decades ago, the federal government, when FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, issues a certificate, the federal right of eminent domain comes along with that. That's an incredibly powerful tool. With electric transmission lines, that same authority doesn't exist under the Federal Power Act. So there are federal authorities in some different circumstances for building transmission. If it's a federal entity, the Federal Power Marketing Administrations, for example, out west. But it doesn't work the same. The locating transmission lines historically has been fundamentally, and siting them, a state responsibility with state authority. And so here, what we have is MISO they've engaged in a transmission planning process. But as Nushin was saying, it still is. There's a federal piece, but involving whether or not the transmission lines will get built and how they get built and what authority there is to build them and site them. There's a big chunk of that comes back to the states. In the East, and in both in the Northeast as well as in New York, with the within the state of New York, there's been a lot of activity in terms of thinking about the development of new transmission lines, really to enable renewables and low carbon resources. In the state of New York, there you've got then where the state of New York has been pushing forward very strongly with the CLCPA law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that was enacted a few years ago, and with some very aggressive carbon reduction goals for the power sector. The state has taken some very aggressive steps forward to both incentivize and enable the development of more zero carbon resources, including offshore wind, and there are various steps going on with respect to building some new lines that would potentially that would both address congestion and reliability, and which the New York ISO has been heavily involved with, as well as some lines that could bring additional Canadian hydropower south to load centers more towards New York City. But in those cases, of course, in the situation where you have one state like New York, there are things that are possible where one state can make things happen. Where you're talking about multiple states and cutting across multiple state lines, those can get very complex.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason, the controversy in Texas, right, with ERCOT and reliability. So they don't interconnect out, and they've, and the reason is they also don't want, any federal oversight. But that also becomes a reliability issue, as we've seen, in the winter storm and a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's definitely, it makes things easier, but then it's also you're kind of out on your own there.
David, can you talk briefly about the hydro line coming down from Canada into New York and the difficulties in siting that? There's even it's not just you can still hear me, right? I've got a notice in my ear that is disconnected. Sorry. There's even it's not just the siting itself, but right now there's a problem with a staging area that the company wants to use along the Hudson River because part of it will be under the Hudson River. And the staging area was used by GE during some PCB cleanups, which is a pretty heavy responsibility to have there. And now they want to use it as staging for equipment for the hydropower, and people are upset. So you've got an already heavily industrial site wanting to be used for this, and people don't want it there. So there have been issues with that coming down, and this is typical of transmission lines. Can you talk briefly about that process and the problems that caused?
Yeah, I mean, I shouldn't get into too many of the specifics on all that, Dale, but I can say that it's just one of these things where it just again just demonstrates the difficulty of well, really any major infrastructure project, but even one where it's really within a single state, and you would say, well, at least you don't have to worry about going across 5 different states and maybe where the politics are different. I mean, which is the case in terms of some other independent system operators, some other regional transmission organizations where you've got to traverse multiple state lines and things like that. That's a very difficult situation. In the state of New York, though, even there, there are complications with it all, and of course, it's New York is a diverse state with a lot of diverse interests, a lot of diverse views about issues, and of course, everybody always feels strongly about their personal property, and so there's it's a difficult set of challenges, but ones where I do think the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean it's impossible. One of my favorite quote, the Seabees. For those who are familiar with the Seabees, the U.S. Navy Seabees, I love their motto. The difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. I believe that's their motto. Just love that. And so, I think we have to sometimes when it comes to things in the power sector and the difficulty of building infrastructure for the future, that's sort of the motto we have to adopt.
And it hadn't occurred to me that your role in the operator means that you can't really talk much about that. And I'm sorry, I should have thought of that and not asked. But I guess the thing that I've been fascinated living in upstate New York to sort of watch this a little bit as it rolled out, and surprised at how quickly it did go through, given the complexities of siting these things, especially since so much of it is underwater. It comes down through Lake Champlain, goes partly in the Hudson. So you would think that would be an easier task to cite that, and yet it still sparked a lot of lawsuits and a lot of problems in doing it.
I do think, Dale, that New York has successfully developed. In fact, one was just put into service just in the last few weeks. That has successfully developed some major new transmission projects, and so it really is in the very recent past, and so it really is a demonstration that the fact that it can happen, it can get done. And in fact, even during the early part of the Bush administration, it's now been 20 years ago, the Path 15 transmission line there in California. I mean, that's one where at the highest levels of the administration, they really put their shoulder to the wheel behind getting it done, and it got done. So this kind of stuff can actually happen. Or as Nushin was talking about, the CREZ lines in Texas, those they can get done. The question doesn't come down to technological capability. Doesn't even come down to the available of money. Really, there's a lot of capital available. It comes down to political will.
Nushin, something that's raised often when citing any sort of infrastructure like this is the question of environmental justice.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about what that means and how reporters can look at those sorts of issues and how they can incorporate them into the process as they do the reporting, if that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially with any new infrastructure, if you're looking at siting, like where are these things going through, right? So you just have the immediate community that's involved. And so that's definitely one, sort of one of the most obvious, easiest low-hanging fruits, right? And so, in this case, again, they're like existing easements, but for, future lines, right? So that's like an issue. And then, what's the fuel source, right? For these, where it's some cases, like, we're talking a lot about renewables, but, there's still like other, natural gas plants being built. And so, the communities that are affected around that, and, fence line communities around fossil fuel industry, like you mentioned, SEJ is doing a webinar, I think next month on methane emissions. And so, that's, that's
So the question is where the siting of these, and it's where the least political power exists, basically, which is poor
right. And
communities,
so the
communities of
routes,
color.
right? So when David talked earlier, you have a 200-mile route, and it could where is it going, right? And so what are the proposed route for whether it's transmission lines or pipelines. You hear a lot about it. We have pipelines are probably in the news more, right? But even with transmission lines. So, who's being, what are the different alternatives? So typically when they give, these proposals for siting, they have the proposed route. And yeah, if it's sometimes what's the most convenient might not, who is it hurting, right? Who's getting their land taken away, or which community is being, divided up. So yeah, that's one. And the other thing also is now that we talk about with I would say even like who's building them, right? So one of the reasons when, in addition to reliability and need, the other thing that's always, we talk about jobs, right? And so that's something that I've recently been looking into, is sort of workforce training and which communities are getting these jobs, whether it's building, and really in that I'm talking about renewable infrastructure, right? So whether it's solar or wind, and having that workforce training so that, communities that are disadvantaged, that they have that access to get a lot of those green jobs as well. So I think that's another thing. That's another, area to look at, not related to siting, but I think that's also another low-hanging fruit, and something that reporters are looking more at.
So we've got 10 minutes left. Let's talk more, if we could, about this, and about what the entry points are for journalists as they look at these stories. So let's segment this first. So there's different processes. There's the siting of the plant, or the wind towers, or the solar panels. There's the siting process. There's the transmission line process. What are the entry points for local journalists? So not necessarily journalists like you, Nushin, who do for national outlets, but for local journalists who don't understand these issues well. What are the entry points for them to start covering these issues for their community?
I would say to really start talking to, grassroots community members, and getting, to know them, right? And what their needs are, and how these different proposals affect them. Wind energy is, we think of it as, it's clean, it's a renewable energy, but not every, there's been some stories where you have, a rancher who has, like, their neighbor has a bunch of like wind farms right next to them, and that's, hurting them, right? Or they say like, oh, the person who owns this large wind farm, they don't even like live here, right? And then that's affecting them. So that's, one way, in rural areas that you could have, something that might seem like, oh, this is, non-controversial because it's clean energy, might still hurt, the local community. So, and again, like with where we're talking about natural gas and infrastructure now, there's, there's some groups like Earthworks, I think, they do like the infrared. They have those cameras where you can actually go and see, and they're going into local communities. So like a local community can call them or, contact them to come say, oh, here's this plan, and, what kind of pollution is being emitted. And so that's something that reporters, can look to see if those communities are doing that and what kind of, like local like emissions that you're seeing or pollution, or even I like the idea there's a lot of citizen sort of scientists out there doing air pollution studies, and so really, like, I think going not just and going to the big national like environmental groups, but really trying to get to know, talking to people, and really knowing, what they're doing on the grassroots level. And that's something that I couldn't stress enough, because there is a lot that they're doing, and they know the community better, and they know what's going on in their, in their backyard.
So I want to put this this photo back up again if I can. This is what you're talking about. These are the cameras that can show these sorts of emissions.
Yeah.
Which is pretty critical, pretty important. And in fact, I'm trying to remember, is it Environmental Working Group?
I think is it Earthworks? I think I have it somewhere. But yeah, I mean, and the thing is with methane, it's clear, right? And so that was, that's why those infrared cameras or.
Yeah, let me stop this. Can you still hear me? My microphone dropped out again. So did my camera.
Yeah.
I love the technology when it works. Here we
It's
go.
Earthbeat, I think. I'm sorry, it's Earthbeat. Is the environment. They use the optical gas imaging.
And I think it's Environmental Working Group. I forget which national group has a methane satellite that went up.
Oh,
so,
I think that's EDF.
Is that, oh, right.
Yeah,
EDF.
Environmental Defense Fund. Yes.
So that's another place that reporters can go.
Yeah.
David, do you have any thoughts on entry points for journalists on this?
So just a couple of quick thoughts, Dale. I think when it comes to just on the subject of the MISO announcement in particular, and transmission, it's different in different parts of the country, and so if I were in Texas, it's the Public Utility Commission of Texas and ERCOT. If it's in the Pacific Northwest, it would be somebody different. If it's in New York, it's somebody different. So in some areas, you have the independent system operators or the regional transmission organizations, which can be terrific sources of information and have a lot of information available on the web, and have very knowledgeable people there to answer questions, and can be great sources of information, both about planning and reliability. In other areas, the best source is a lot of the time the local utility. It might be an investor-owned or a rural electric cooperative or a public power entity in the area. Just in terms of their transmission planning, where they are, what they're thinking about, both reliability as well as cost, and as well as what it is that they're doing to enable new resources.
And it's also a great source of just simply background information. I mean, a lot of local journalists have no concept of how a grid works.
Yeah.
So going to these groups just to sit down and say, explain to me how this process works. Explain to me the difficulties that you have with the process. That alone.
It's a great point, Dale, because I think that, how the power system works according to the laws of physics, not according to politics or economics or what people would like to have happen. And so whether or not resources are actually interchangeable, and what it is you actually need in order to maintain reliability on the system, I really do think that there's a lot that the public doesn't understand, and they may think that if that wind facility goes up, that gas plant can go away. Well, now it's got to be backed up. It's got to be there. So there are ways that the system has to work together. And I think that those resources that we were talking about, those information resources, can be really good for explaining to people how it works and what is possible in what way and on what time frame. The other thing that I would actually really encourage is somebody is going to pay for all of this. And I think that when I was in the government, one of my colleagues at, I think he was over at NASA, was over meeting with me about something one day, and we were talking about something, and he said, "Well, you know what my grandpappy or what always used to say, no matter what anybody says it's all about, what it's really all about is money." And I think there's when it comes to all sorts of things having to do with the energy transition in the United States, the cost allocation questions. What is it going to cost? Who is going to bear the cost? Who should rightfully bear the cost? And where is the government, as a policy matter, where are those costs being put? Because some of what goes on some of the time is, instead of things, just my personal view, instead of things being socialized through tax or tax policy, well, they're getting put on maybe in terms of bill add-ons, or they're getting put in other places. And I think journalists can really perform a great service by figuring out where are the costs, what are the costs, and who's bearing them. That can be a real public benefit.
And
Well,
I
and
would,
sorry, go ahead, Nushin.
no, I would just add, Dale, that also with these issues, I mean, these are very local issues, because how people even pay for power, varies greatly depending on where you live in the country, right? And so whether you're in a regulated state, unregulated, whether the generation, all of that is owned by one utility. And so it is, so it's confusing, like it's very confusing to, residents. And, in ERCOT, we have like retail, you pick. And I mean, it's like, I used to cover power, and I can't, I wouldn't be able to tell you what's a good deal, right? To pick your energy, because you pick your own, retail provider, right? So, so I can't imagine like a person who isn't exposed to this knowing that. So I think it's, an explainer is a great service to readers. And then also, as we put more renewable, I mean, we're talking about like now there's, the idea of microgrids or solar battery storage, in homes. And so there's also this, you're talking about, David, about building a wind, a wind turbine and it replacing a natural gas facility. Another thing that people, I think, sometimes misconstrue is they think, oh, well, if I have, a solar power, like rooftop, I don't have to be hooked up to the grid. And it's like, well, it doesn't really work like that. Even if you have, even if, you have that solar or, a solar farm, you're not directly, solar farm to building, right? It still all goes back to the grid. And so I think explaining that to readers is, having those explainers, I think, is really important.
But journalists, it's funny, journalists tend to shy away from these kinds of stories. And David, you talked about infrastructure in general, and I've said for a long time that politicians don't get elected by talking about infrastructure, but they should. There's a town 30 minutes south of me that has 100-year-old wooden water mains that are leaking a lot of water and causing a lot of financial difficulties, among other things, for the community's water system. But the politicians can't get those dug up and replaced because the cost is immense. And when it's out of sight, it's out of mind to most voters and most citizens and to most journalists. But these are critical things to talk about as our infrastructure is failing, as we saw with, I don't know about you guys, but up around here, it's amazing once the infrastructure bill passed, how much road construction and bridge replacement is happening up here. It's disruptive, but I drive over those bridges looking and thinking, boy, I hope it lasts till I get across because they're in bad shape. But we don't get elected talking about them, and journalists tend to not talk about them because other people aren't. But these issues are ripe for these kinds of stories, these explainer stories that you're talking about, Nasheen. You also talked about community groups. You talked about grassroots community groups. We didn't really talk about what that means. And I want to suggest that there are great ways of looking at these. So when you're talking, for instance, about power line transmission siting, talk to farmers groups, talk to the ag representatives, the cooperative extension people, go out and talk to the farmer co-ops, because these are people who are often severely affected by this. They may get some money for siting of solar and siting of wind, but there's a lot of controversy in those communities where some farmers hate the guys who put that in and they're ruining. But there's all sorts of new models for farming shade tolerant crops underneath solar panels and putting panels up in a way that you can get a tractor under if you need. There's all sorts of innovation going on to allow this to occur. Anyway, so there's by looking at those sorts of things, one of the biggest community groups out there to talk to when you're having these issues are church groups. Church groups have study groups, they have community meetings, they're ways of transmitting information. It's a way of accessing information if you're attuned to that. So these are also entry points for journalists with these sorts of stories. We're past our time. Do you have any last minute thoughts, any other ideas on this or other thoughts for takeaways for journalists? Nushin?
So I know when I started covering power, it's very technical and it can be intimidating for a journalist. I know, I just have a journalism degree. So I don't have, and most people in power have an electrical engineering degree. So do not be afraid to ask questions. Don't be intimidated. I think, just, explain it to me in layman terms, keep going back and you'll find the sources who are good. They're knowledgeable and they can explain it in layman terms. So it can be intimidating. And that might be another reason why people don't like, reporters might shy away from some of these issues, but really just, keep asking questions and don't be afraid to have people explain things over and over again. So, because you're doing your readers, just an invaluable service by being able to explain these important issues to them.
Great advice. David, any last thoughts on this?
Just I completely second everything that Nushin just said. I think it provides reporting in this area and really digging below just sort of the old canards that people throw out there and act as if that say as they'll say them as if they mean something and they don't mean anything. I mean, or no one understands it, but no one actually digs below it. I think that it's a very complex industry, and it's complex because of I always think about the three things. Well, there are obviously a lot more than three, but there are the physics. There's how the system operates. There's the economics of it, and then there's the legal regulatory structure, really the political regulatory legal structure. And in order to really understand how these things work, you kind of need to understand all three of those, and that's a very tall order. I think that journalists, and yet when we're talking about climate, we're talking about the if not the most important issue of our time and for our kids, certainly one of the most important, and one that involves a lot of money, a lot of people's futures. I mean, I can't think of anything more important for people to understand the decisions that are being made today. Going back to a point you made earlier, Dale, I mean, these decisions actually will affect things for years in the future, and their decades, centuries maybe. And so it's just critically important people understand it. And I think journalists have a real opportunity to educate people in the country about this, so that they can make informed decisions and make more informed decisions too when they show up to vote. So I think it's a real opportunity for service by the journalism profession.
Great. This has been a wonderful program. Thank you both. David Hill of Columbia University and Nasheen Hook, freelance journalist based in Texas. I'm very grateful to have had you with us. Also, thanks to Society of Environmental Journalists for partnering with us on this. Next week, we'll do it all again. In the meantime, if you want to rewatch this program or any other program in our series, be sure to check out Andy Revkin's YouTube page. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.